Hello, students. Kukuluku. Hello. And I join you again to continue our discussion of animal ethics. In the last session, we presented Peter Singer's argument for the conclusion that our farming of animals, our experimenting on animals is typically wrong, typically seriously wrong. I'm going to open the slides. Or at least try to open the slides so that you can see where we left off, and there it is. We try to simplify, capture his argument with two premises and a conclusion. It's on your screen. We should give equal weight to the like interests of all those affected by our actions. That is why racism and sexism are wrong, after all. But farming and experimenting on animals doesn't give equal weight to their interests. Therefore, we should typically not farm or experiment on animals. I wonder if this is perfectly logically tight, but it's good enough for our purposes here. And I'm going to consider a couple of objections against this argument and some replies to those objections. Then I'll present an argument, a similar argument from, well, an argument for a similar conclusion from Tom Regan. There are some differences, and consider yet further objections, some of which apply to the argument here. Oh, okay. And here is our first objection, which bites the bullet somewhat. The objection is that we were wrong to say, as we did, that we shouldn't discriminate between humans. Okay. And just as we might discriminate between humans, we might discriminate between humans and animals. Recall one particular proposal about why causing harm to animals might be permissible. The idea was that animals differ significantly from humans in their intelligence. And against that proposal, we objected that it isn't usually permissible for us to mistreat humans just because they are, or some are, less intelligent than us. It isn't permissible to mistreat newborns, the mentally disabled, and so on, even if they are less intelligent than us. It's not permissible for the Isaac Newtons and Albert Einsteins of the world to exploit the rest of us just because we are less intelligent than them. Well, this objection, I suppose, denies that point. Here's a little quote from Frey. I'm sorry I don't have the date or page number in here, but don't you leave out proper citations in your essays. And Kukuluku will read it for us.
I do not regard all human life as of equal value. I do not accept that a very severely mentally enfeebled human or an elderly human fully in the grip of senile dementia or an infant with only half a brain has a life whose value is equal to that of a normal adult human.
So the idea here is that we might not regard equally the interests of people who are less intelligent. Maybe that strikes you as immediately counterintuitive. But I think, and here's a rather plodding reply to the objection, that even if we grant Frey's point, I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly. I've never really met him. Frey? Somehow I have a sense it's Frey. I think that even if we grant his point that not all human life is of equal value, even if we grant that we might take advantage of people who are less intelligent than us, that doesn't mean that abusing them in any which way is permissible. Even if you think, for example, that someone who's significantly less intelligent than us, someone who's mentally disabled, um, that their interests aren't of as much value as ours, I think that you would not regard it as permissible to torture them. Similarly, the reply goes, even if animals are of less value than humans, even if we shouldn't be taking their interests into account equally, farming and experimenting on them is quite like torture. Factory farming of animals, as described in the previous little section, involves submitting them to extremely intensive suffering, and so is still wrong. Okay, that's a simple objection and a simple reply to the objection. Even if you think maybe you think a biological criterion is the right one, right? Maybe you think what makes a moral difference is just biology somehow. And so let's say you are a racist or a sexist, and you think that people who are biologically different from us, they have different chromosomes or what have you, that their interests shouldn't be taken into equal consideration as ours. I think that you would still think that factory farming and experimenting on such people so freely would be morally wrong. Similarly, if you think that mere species difference, this mere biological difference between humans and animals marks a moral difference, you might not think that it marks so significant a difference that we should be able to factory farm and experiment on animals. Okay, another simple objection number 2. The idea is that while factory farming causes a lot of suffering, we could replace factory farms with happier kinds of farms, where animals are treated better, where they don't live in such cramped environments. Maybe they're given more natural environments, where they're given very good care, medical care, and so on. They're not physically mishandled in any way. They're not submitted to castration or tail docking without anesthetics. They're not kept in tight crates, and so on. The idea is that this kind of farming might take the interests of the animals into consideration. And over here, again, we have a rather plodding response. The argument is that factory farming and animal experimentation is pretty widespread. Most farming and experimentation does involve a lot of suffering. It does inflict a lot of harm on the animals. So even if we allow for some exceptions, we allow for family farms and so on, the argument still shows that most of our practices involving animals are seriously wrong. This exception wouldn't, I think, be allowed by Tom Regan's argument, which we'll turn to in a moment. Tom Regan's argument also might not face the following objection that is leveled, objection 3, that's leveled against the principle of the equal consideration of interests. That tells us that we should give equal weight to the interests of all those affected by action, regardless of their race, gender, species. What matters is whether the creature has interests, preferences, can suffer, can feel pleasure. But the idea is that this principle, so unqualified, means that we should give equal weight even to the interests of bad people, even to the bad interests of bad people. And here's an illustration from Regan. Again, I don't cite the page or date. Forgive me, but don't make the same mistake. It's a rather macabre illustration. Apologies. Kukuluku, well, maybe Kukuluku won't read this because I don't think Kukuluku's voice, sorry Kukuluku, fits with the grim nature of the objection. Quote, sometime back, 4 teenage boys raped and in other ways sexually abused a seriously retarded teenage girl. And that, I guess, is not terminology we'd use these days. Among other things, as I recall, the boys took special pleasure in invading her body with a broom handle and Coke bottle. Okay. Now, the objection is that the principle of equal consideration of interests doesn't make sense of why their behavior was wrong. Of course, their behavior seems grossly morally wrong. But if the interests of the 4 boys in sexual pleasure out cumulatively, since there are 4 of them, and people do have an interest in pleasure, if their cumulative interest in sexual pleasure did outweigh the interests of the girl not to be raped, she has an interest not to be abused in this way, to suffer the pain. They have an interest in feeling the pleasure. Well, there are 4 of them. Maybe if we put things in the balance here, we'll see that their interests outweigh her interest, is the idea. Okay, and the principle of equal consideration of interests would then have a very counterintuitive implication that what the boys did wasn't wrong. In fact, what they did was morally, maybe even obligatory, depending on how we state that principle, I guess. But it at least wouldn't entail that their actions are morally wrong. And that seems crazy. Okay. And allows for a simple reply. Okay. The simple reply is that the girl's interests are not plausibly outweighed. Sure, there's an interest in, the boys have an interest in this pleasure, in sexual pleasure, but the pleasure they'd obtain just isn't enough, even with 4 of them, to outweigh the severe physical and psychological suffering that the girl has in not being submitted to this torture. So the principle of equal consideration of interest does give us the right result. Okay. She has an interest not to be tortured. They have an interest in pleasure. But if you consider the degree of the pleasure and against the degree of the torture, the principle of equal consideration of interests has the result that they shouldn't torture her, even if they are deriving some pleasure from it. And the principle makes sense of why what the boys did is wrong. There is a reply to this objection, to the reply to the objection, a reply to the reply of the objection. Okay, maybe this means that the objection in some form still stands. You might imagine a depraved enough audience. These aren't 4 ordinary boys. Maybe there are many boys who derive extreme pleasure from torturing this girl. Well, if you stipulate it with enough details and make their pleasure extreme enough until it outweighs her interest in not suffering, the principle of equal consideration of interests does seem to get us at the conclusion that their torturing the girl isn't wrong. Okay. As I put it there, imagine enough of a depraved audience deriving perverse pleasure from watching the girl being tortured. Maybe the incident is recorded and displayed to a large group of perverts for their pornographic interest in seeing such torture. Imagine that this group is large enough that so much pleasure is derived from watching the torture. Then the principle of equal consideration of interests would tell us that the behavior of the boys isn't seriously morally wrong, maybe isn't wrong at all, maybe is morally obligatory, morally praiseworthy, and that seems crazy. Okay. What seems crazy is that the interests of the boys counts in favor of their behavior at all, even in the case where it is outweighed by the interests of the girl in not experiencing this torture. The principle of the equal consideration of interests has the interests of the boys count. And you might think the interests of the boys in the sexual pleasure shouldn't count at all. Okay. Or if it should count at all, it should count in the opposite direction. The pleasure that they'd experience makes their behavior worse than it would otherwise be. So there's an objection against the principle of equal consideration of interests. That is premise one of the argument as I've framed it. Maybe we shouldn't be taking all interests into consideration equally. Maybe some interests don't count, as this case illustrates. Maybe there are some kinds of rights that individuals have that means that they can't be used or abused, no matter how much pleasure our using or abusing them might result in. And that point, that thought, is a segue to Tom Regan's argument about animal rights. I'm going to present this argument now, maybe pause after it, and then continue with the objections, because I like to break these sessions down into smaller sections so that in case I make some sort of error, embarrassing error, I don't have to rewind and start from the beginning. Okay, let me move my little camera here. And apologies for the very low key nature of the slides and presentation. Again, this is awkward and on short notice. I have no idea whether it's better than last time. It certainly is less exciting and entertaining than class, but you get the point. That's the main thing. So Regan's argument involves some terminology, somewhat technical terminology, especially the terminology of subjects of a life and inherent value. I'm not sure really that all this terminology is needed or does so much work for him. Basically, the idea of being a subject of a life is being a psychological subject. A subject of a life is a subject that has psychological states, a subject that has beliefs, desires, emotions, sensations, something that can feel pleasure or pain. You are a subject of a life. A cat or a mouse or
Cuckoo, yay!
is the subject of a life because Kukulukku can feel pleasure and pain. Maybe even Kukulukku is cognitively sophisticated enough to have beliefs and desires
and purposes and intentions and philosophical views.
Okay, that was a bit of a wicked laugh. Kukulukku isn't wicked. Kukulukku is a very good koala. Good koala. I don't know if koalas purr. And then the next term is the notion of inherent value. And I guess the terminology is naturally enough. An inherent value is some value that doesn't depend on extrinsic factors. Okay, a value that's had regardless of the interests of others or your use to them, a value that's had regardless of how much effort you put in, regardless of how things are going for you. You have this intrinsic value. You are of value, whether or not some other people value you, whether or not you are useful to other people. You have intrinsic value, regardless of how well you've behaved or badly you've behaved. You have inherent value, regardless of whether you are now happy or sad. Maybe you're behaving well. Maybe your being happy increases the value of your life in some way. but you do have inherent value nonetheless. And this is the kind of thing that brings along moral rights. You're being a subject of a life, you're having inherent value. Well, I guess you're being a subject of a life, as we'll see, brings along your having inherent value. And your having inherent value bestows upon you rights to be respected and not mistreated. Oopsie. And that last sentence captures what's going on in Regan's argument. I've tried to distill it here with 5 premises and a conclusion. Again, I don't know if it's perfectly logically tight. I slapped this up relatively, well, maybe I didn't slap it up. I might have copied and pasted it from somewhere, but I didn't do a very good job. You can see that there's a period here, not all others. It's probably enough to serve our purposes. Animals are subjects of a life. Okay. They are psychological subjects, have beliefs, desires, or at least can experience emotions or sensations. Anything that is a subject of a life, second premise, has inherent value. Anything that's a subject of a life has the kind of value that doesn't depend on the usefulness of the subject to others. We should typically, premise 3, not harm anything with inherent value. That has to do with their the rights that having inherent value bestows upon the subject. Therefore, conclusion, we shouldn't harm animals. Killing animals, farming animals, experimenting on animals does harm animals. Therefore, we shouldn't kill, farm, or experiment on animals. You'll notice a little difference between this conclusion and Singer's conclusion, and that is that we shouldn't kill animals either. They have a kind of right to life. Singer's argument doesn't get us entangled in thoughts about rights, such as rights to life. And indeed, Singer wonders about whether the principle of equal considerations or other aspects of his view entails that it is wrong to kill animals. He has some thoughts about while it's the case that our hurting animals, inflicting pain upon animals is wrong, our killing them, at least relatively painlessly, might not be wrong. And these have to do with some rather subtle thoughts about replaceability that he has that I won't get into. But Regan's work is more entangled in thoughts about rights, which are quite strict, which mean that having a right means that it's typically wrong to harm you or to infringe on that right, even if it serves the interests of others. And one salient right is a right to life. So Regan's argument, and I'm simplifying a lot here, it has a stricter conclusion, a more extreme conclusion than Singer's. We shouldn't kill animals, farm animals, or experiment on animals. And even in cases where we too have an interest in using or exploiting animals in this way, and where by Singer's lights our interests might occasionally outweigh the interests of the animals, Regan doesn't allow for that. Okay, we'll consider objections and replies in a moment, but I'm already getting a little bit distracted and disoriented. So before I make some terrible, embarrassing mistake that's more embarrassing than the others I've made so far, before you have to listen to too many ums and ahs, I'm going to stop the recording, save the video, and then start in a new section. See you soon.